Hey, welcome to the Red Review, everybody. Or, as I'm hoping to call it, the Red Maple? I don't know. Send us your thoughts. This is a podcast brought to you by Socialist Action Canada, Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste.
I'm Daniel from so-called Toronto.
And I'm Dan from 20% of a recording studio in my unfinished basement.
Yeah, the biggest updates for us here. Well, first of all, happy Pride to all of our listeners. And we have a big treat for you today. We're going to have a special guest on later today, Gary Kinsman of the No Pride and Policing Coalition, talking about how we ought to be bringing Pride back to its radical roots. But the other update we have is Dan has moved into his new home. So congrats to Dan.
Thanks. It was very sudden. How was your June? First off, Daniel.
My June has been busy, but it's been gratifying. There's been a lot of organizing, and I live in Toronto. You live near Moncton and New Brunswick, so I'm just very envious that you live in a place where, home prices are still somewhat affordable, I guess. But we also have a topic on that today as well, where we'll talk about the supposed free market in Canada when it comes to housing.
Yeah, so I do apologize if anybody is gonna hear like construction sounds. They like if you hear this during the podcast, we're gonna try to make sure that doesn't happen. But yeah, it has been an insane month. Basically, what happened was we started getting some feedback, saying that maybe the podcast was a little bit, too formal. So I took that to heart. And I went out and tried to make sure that I was going to be the worst at podcasting this episode at least, and see how you felt about it. I went out and I made sure that not only was I desperately trying to get things together in this unfinished basement so that it would be suitable for recording, I also went out and got my COVID shot 2 days ago, like a second dose of Pfizer 2 days ago. So this is a doozy.
So you're a Pfizer guy, because I'm a Moderna guy. I'm super loyal to my particular brand of vaccine.
Yeah, well, since that matters in our world, brand consciousness is important. I am, yes, Team Pfizer or Dizer. I will take that to the grave, which right now feels like it's going to be pretty soon.
In addition to talking about what's happening with the housing market in Canada, in addition to interviewing Gary Kinsman of No Pride and Policing Coalition, this month we'll also be talking about what's happening in British Columbia with old growth logging. We're going to keep talking about what's happening in Palestine and Israeli apartheid.
And we've got some new stories as well, right? About the toppling of statues by Indigenous activists, covering some of the Islamophobic terror attacks that have been going on, and the Canadian Labour Congress, and also something that's going on with the Green Party. I don't know. I haven't been following Green Party news. There's just too much stuff going on.
And we promise, if most of the topics are heavy, and they are, we realize that making a podcast about what's happening in Canada and trying to do so truthfully just makes for a pretty bleak podcast. But the Green Party turmoil will be the last thing we cover. And you can treat it like a little palate cleanser at the end, just to instead focus on the soap opera that is the Green Party right now.
Everyone who worked on this podcast lives and works on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island. Now, we recognize that there can't be any true reconciliation without restitution, including land back and seizing the assets of the major resource corporations, returning them to the commons. And we want listeners to also, this episode, have a content warning. We're going to be diving into some heavy topics like genocide within colonial borders and abroad, as well as police violence and hate crimes. But before we begin this Red Maple review, let's hear from Comrade Ellen, who is going to tell you about our sponsor this month.
This month, the Red Review is not being sponsored by Pan American Silver, a Vancouver-based mining company. Our editorial board faced the daunting challenge of singling out just one Canadian mining company, given that more mining companies call Canada home than any other nation, with nearly half of all global mining companies being listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange due to notoriously weak regulations. But Pan American Silver won out by stoking violence against the Xinga indigenous people living in Guatemala that opposed the Escobal mine, by expanding the La Colorado mine in Mexico and forcibly displacing 40 families, by abandoning the Quiruvilca mine in La Libertad, Peru, a ticking environmental time bomb, and by pressuring authorities in Chubut, Argentina, to repeal a mining ban and fomenting even more violence against indigenous water defenders. We oppose all ecocidal and imperialist Canadian mining companies and would like to extend our support to Mining Watch Canada, which routinely exposes these dastardly acts committed in the name of never-ending profit.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And our first item is going to be a discussion of the rise in Islamophobia here in Canada. On June 6th, a white supremacist attacked the Utsfal family in London, Ontario, simply because they were Muslim. He killed grandmother Talat Utsfal, father and mother Salman and Madiha, and children Yumna, while seriously injuring child Fayez. The young white supremacist faces now charges of terrorism. Now, the murder of the Utsfal family in London, Ontario, is characterized by many as an aberration and some sort of betrayal of what it means to be Canadian.
I've definitely heard that.
Right?
Sorry, I've definitely heard that. It's it's kind of exasperating to me, but
No, absolutely. And there's so many reasons why we can, counter that narrative. So in 2013, you had the ruling Parti Québécois introducing Bill 60 in Quebec, which was called the Quebec Charter of Values, and which explicitly targeted Muslims and Sikhs and other religious minorities who wear, head coverings or other more overt symbols of their religion. And then in 2015, you had Stephen Harper's Conservatives pledging to institute a police hotline where people can report barbaric cultural practices, with then Immigration Minister Chris Alexander saying, "We need to stand up for our values," which actually I think is a great counter to the idea that this is an aberration, because we have mainstream politicians being very clear that being Muslim is not in keeping with our values, that in a lot of ways it might be barbaric.
And we have to remember that less than 5 years ago as well, in just the start of 2017, there was another white supremacist attack on a mosque in Quebec City. If people still remember back as far as 2017, these Islamophobic attacks, they've been increasing between 2018 and 2019, and they increased by 9%. Between those years. The coverage of Muslim communities during COVID-19 as super spreaders was stoked with fear and violence. And we've got, there's also, again, and we'll talk about it later, but more biased coverage of Israel and Palestine. And the same month that 4 Muslims were murdered in London, a Muslim man living in Saskatoon got stabbed, had his beard cut off, just a few days ago on June 25th. And what gets me, I think, is that these are just stats from Canada, right? We can look at Canada like Chris Alexander did, be like, we need to stand up for our values. And even if you take that somehow in the best, in a light that is positive, it's neglecting to note that our culture, our media, everything that we consider, Canadian, is inherently tied to the politics that are and the events that are happening around the world.
Yep.
Especially the things that are happening to our south.
Yep.
There's some horrible stats from Canada that I know you've got, but just because even if the stats in Canada weren't so atrocious, it doesn't negate the realities of just sort of this cultural climate that we live in.
No, absolutely. So you alluded to those stats I have on what's happening in Canada. There was a recent report on Islamophobia prepared by legal analyst and writer Aziza Kanji, and this was released just near the end of 2020, so before the attack in London. And I'm assuming Aziza Kanji would, strongly disagree with the sentiment that what happened in London was some sort of one-off, because the statistics that she assembled are illuminating, to say the least. So 52% of Canadians feel that Muslims can only be trusted a little or not at all. 42% of Canadians think discrimination against Muslims is mainly their fault. 47% of Canadians support banning headscarves in public, and that's actually higher than Americans. Only 30% of Americans believe that. And then 46% of Canadians have an unfavorable view of Islam, which is more than any other religious tradition. Now, one of the groups that sponsored this report is the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. And that group was founded shortly after Parliament in Canada passed the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001. And Canada, in passing that act, was following on the heels of the United States, which also passed a lot of reactionary bills like the Patriot Act following the 9/11 terror attacks. So you're really correct to point out that what is happening south of the border is influencing what is happening here. You get American hate groups like America First, and then in Canada, we get the Canadian hate group, Canada First. And they like each other, despite the fact that you would think that their respective names would indicate some sort of conflict. But in reality, they both are standing for white supremacy on either side of the border.
You mean it's not just about nationalism? Like it's not solely about politics and economics? That's wild. No. I would never have thought.
I never would have thought either that the white nationalists on both sides of the border are so cozy with each other, but that's the case. And I would encourage that any person out there who is now, stoked or feels that this deserves more attention, look into these groups like the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. Support the work that they do, and join us on the ground when we stand up against the fascists and the white supremacists, because they mobilize, and they're mobilizing more and more, as we're seeing just this last month.
Speaking of white supremacy, cops have been getting away with murder just all over the place. Yeah, on June 7th, up in my neck of the woods here, the New Brunswick Public Prosecution Service says no charges are warranted against the police officer involved in the death of Chantel Moore. So Chantel Moore, if you recall, was an Indigenous woman from the Glaukwiat First Nations in the place that we call British Columbia. A police officer shot and murdered Chantel Moore on June 4th of last year after being called to conduct a wellness check. It's just the latest instance of the Canadian state and its private goons being absolved of cold-blooded murder. Dondre Campbell was murdered by Peel police on April 6th, and his murderers were absolved on December 14th of last year. The Toronto cops who stormed Regis Korchinski-Paquette's apartment on May 27th and killed her were absolved by Ontario's Special Investigations Unit, or SIU, on August 26th. And Isaj Chowdhury was murdered by Peel police on June 20th and absolved April 6th of this year. They were all racialized and murdered by police during wellness checks of all things, and there's still no justice.
And just as a reminder that the investigators working for the SIU, the Special Investigations Unit, they're mostly former cops. Like 75% roughly of the investigators working for what is meant to be an independent oversight body are former cops. And you have a situation then where police are policing the police, and they're, strangely enough, not doing a great job. And we just, named 4 of the victims of Canadian police in 2020. 34 people in total were killed and shot by police. And where race could be identified, 48% of people shot were Indigenous and 19 were Black. And this does not include the people like Regis Korchinski-Paquette, who were not shot but were killed in other ways. It does not include deaths that were covered up and, claimed to be a suicide or claimed to be, natural causes. And the CBC article where I pulled those stats right now, it is titled Police Shootings in 2020, The Effect on Officers and Those They Are Sworn to Protect. Dan, what is wrong with the title there?
I'm going to go out on a limb and just say that the way I am today, you read that and I was just like, oh yeah, wow, okay, that's an article, and I didn't even register until you stopped. I want to read it out again here because it's police shootings in 2020, the effect on, emphasis mine, officers and those they are sworn to protect. So putting officers first there, that's wild.
It's
that's
pretty
a
wild.
CBC article. That's not even like, wow.
It's not even like the Toronto Sun. It's the CBC,
Yeah.
and they want to evoke empathy for the police officers, and we're not going to do that here. Instead, I want to highlight an event I went to on June 27th. I attended the No Pride in Policing Coalition Pride March. It's a group that formed in 2018 to fight to win the demands that Black Lives Matter put forward when they halted the 2016 Toronto Pride Parade. Author and activist Desmond Cole was at this event, and he poured out libation for those brown, Black, and Indigenous people killed by police, and pointed out that there are so many whose names we don't know, where police cover up their own acts. And so later, we will be talking to the author and a No Pride in Policing activist, Gary Kinsman, about what pride means to him and the efforts to return pride to its militant roots.
Daniel, since the last time we recorded, I went out. We made an offer on a house. We bought the house, and everything was very rushed and incredibly stressful. And again, I was really just trying to make myself tired for this podcast. Just really get myself sounding authentic and tired.
You did a good job.
And I did say this was going to be a long segue, and it is, but I bought a house. Do you know who else is buying a house?
No, tell
or
us.
Or multiple homes? All right. It's so the Core Development Group has raised $250 million in capital, which it plans to use to purchase more than 400 residential properties in target communities in Ontario. So these homes are going to be rented out to families who presumably were unable to outbid Core Development Group and purchase the property themselves, and now has to pay a premium for the privilege of renting. It's a relatively new concept here in Canada. By relatively new concept, I don't mean renting. That is really not new, unfortunately. But it's this sort of corporate ownership that allows people to buy stake in the companies, and it's been used to great success in the U.S., especially following the global financial crisis. So, back then, all these venture capitalists, they swooped in, they acquired foreclosed homes while the workers living there got put out on the street by repossession agencies, and it is estimated that U.S. markets in which these groups operated increased real estate prices by 1.4% on average, leading to a recovery, but a massive downturn in home ownership. Mm-hmm. So the American housing prices have been recovering, even going up, but the ownership rate continued to actually fall until 2016, which is just wild. And now we're getting that in Canada.
Now we're getting that in Canada as well.
It's very exciting.
It's actually super exciting. For a long time, these different corporations were thinking it just wasn't possible here. But it's amazing to know that the Canadian dream is still alive and well, and you can get together a bunch of billionaires to buy up a bunch of homes and make money off of it. So for anybody who is unclear about what's happening, the free market solution to the lack of affordable housing is specifically then to exploit the people that can no longer afford homes by buying the homes, and they try and buy them in a cluster. It's very clear that they're trying to buy homes in a cluster so they can greatly influence the rental market in a very specific region. And they're targeting cities like Guelph that have very low rental vacancy rates, where you have all this competition for available places to live, and they saw that as an enticing market. And indeed, in Guelph, the price of a home increased by an average of $200,000 during the pandemic. So this is where they're targeting. You know, people can't buy homes anymore. So you get wealthy people coming together to buy the homes and then to exploit all the people who need homes, and they're just going to be dependent on them now. And it's a really unfortunate situation. Some people might think that if there's an increase in rental vacancy, that it will maybe lead to a decrease in rent, but that's obviously not the case. Rent has just been going up and up, despite the fact that vacancy rates tend to fluctuate. And vacancy rates have actually been increasing since 2016 in Ontario, and rent is still just exploding.
Yeah, what I'm very excited about, honestly, is a future where we can all continue to not have to worry about property maintenance, not have to worry about getting those pesky lawyers involved with our legal fees for closing costs.
As a renter myself, I refuse to do any maintenance work here. If I need a light bulb change, I am calling in the landlord to do it. That's my own form of praxis here.
You know what? Good for you.
Good for me, right? Kudos. Now, staying in Ontario, because we have our Ford government here that loves to make news for us to cover on the podcast. I hear he's a big fan. Ford and his Ontario provincial government is utilizing the notwithstanding clause for the first time in Canadian history to push through legislation that aims to limit third-party advertising for the 12 months leading up to an election campaign. Now, Section 33 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the notwithstanding clause, and this allows provincial or federal governments to declare an act or a provision thereof shall operate notwithstanding a provision included in Section 2 or Section 7 to 15 of this charter. In other words, it allows the federal government or a provincial government to effectively nullify any limitation included within Sections 2 or 7 to 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that may, impede their legislative power. Now, Dan, do you want to give us a smattering of some of these sections and what can be just completely trampled by evoking this notwithstanding clause?
Right. It's nothing huge. They can surpass things on like limitations on search and seizure, life, liberty, security, basic freedoms like religion, expression, peaceful assembly, association, rights when you're dealing with the police, arbitrary detention, protection against that, equality rights. It's nothing big. The right to an interpreter, protection against self-incrimination, cruel and unusual treatment and punishment.
We can obviously trust Ford to use this very responsibly.
Clearly, he's a politician.
He's a politician. He's a public servant.
A public servant, absolutely.
The first topic we covered today was the rise in Islamophobia, and I mentioned that the Parti Québécois introduced Bill 60 in 2013, so that was the Quebec Charter of Values that sought to ban public servants from wearing any overt religious symbols. That did not pass. Ultimately, there was an election, and they lost that election, but they were threatening to use the notwithstanding clause to push that through. Now, Ford succeeded where the Parti Québécois did not. The provincial conservative government originally introduced new legislation to limit the amount of money that third-party organizations, so non-political parties, how much they can spend on advertising in the 12 months prior to a provincial election. It was primarily intended by Ford to limit the ability of unions and other worker-representing groups that are critical of Doug Ford's provincial conservative government. And you're actually already starting to see commercials in Ontario that are targeting him because we're going towards an election next year. So this legislation was challenged by Working Families in Ontario, which is a group of over 60 different unions and union locals. And earlier this month, the Ontario Superior Court ruled that it violated the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms as it represented a limit to free speech. So we already went through a lot of those different sections. So to circumvent this ruling, the progressive conservatives opted to reintroduce the act, but invoking Section 33. So the first time in Ontario history that the notwithstanding clause has been used, and it is being used so that the progressive conservative government can limit the voice of workers critical of their government. And it was used despite the ruling being delivered very quickly in the first place, so that the government had options to work collaboratively with opposition parties and amend the legislation so that it no longer contravened the charter. But instead, they opted for the quote-unquote nuclear option.
Yeah, I've been hearing about how Ford's trying to spin it. he's trying to keep money out of politics, avoid the U.S. style politics. Nobody wants billionaires trying to influence elections and buy up all the ad space, right? That's a terrible Doug Ford impression.
That was actually really good, I was going to say.
Oh, okay. Well, great. I've got a bright future. However, I think those two issues are real different, right? Like it doesn't limit the amount of influence that corporations can have on political parties via campaign financing, right? Canada and Ontario also already have laws against that. It's about ensuring that the discourse in Ontario politics is limited only to those areas that the established major political parties deem appropriate, right? So any group of workers, regular folks who want to see real change and directly influence policy from current or future governments, can no longer make those appeals to the public. Not directly in some kind of attempt to shift the conversation away from existing talking points, right? It's just about silencing workers, plain and simple.
And that really is Ford's specialty. He is very much about pushing through all the anti-worker legislation that one could possibly imagine.
Welcome to our second Canadian Heritage Moment. 1 minute of reflection on what it really means to be Canadian. Here at Red Review, we are celebrating the fact that 1 year ago, on June 18th, Justin Trudeau failed to secure a permanent seat for Canada on the United Nations Security Council. This despite a budget of $1.74 million to hire 13 full-time staff members and to invite diplomats to a Celine Dion concert in New York. The NDP Foreign Affairs critic noted that this failure was no doubt due to Canada's record in development assistance, peacekeeping, climate change, and Indigenous rights. And the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which was founded about a year ago to oppose Canada's seat at the Security Council, has been updating us regularly on Canada's overseas faux pas. We at Red Review note that the Trudeau government refused to join 122 countries at the 2017 UN conference to prohibit nuclear weapons, voted against 50 UN resolutions upholding Palestinian rights, and recently signed a new arms deal with Saudi Arabia. With a track record like this, has there ever been a more quintessential Canadian heritage moment?
So if our listeners remember, last month we covered the horrific but entirely unsurprising discovery of 215 dead Indigenous children on the grounds of what was once the Kamloops residential school. Since then, the total number of unmarked graves continued to grow. People who have been paying attention probably weren't incredibly surprised by this, but the news has really rattled things on the mainstream. On the grounds of former Brandon, Manitoba residential school, there were another 104 unmarked graves found, and then just a few weeks ago, 751 unmarked graves were found at the Marival Indian Residential School, which was operated by the Roman Catholic Church up until 1997. So this residential school is in southeast Saskatchewan, where the Cowessess First Nation can be found. The horrors of this colonization, this genocide that is Canada continues to come to the forefront, especially this month.
Hey, comrades. Literally, while we were recording this segment, the news broke that another residential school was searched with ground-penetrating radar. This one is in British Columbia's south interior, the Ketunaha Nation, and they found another 182 unmarked graves. As these numbers continue to come out, I also see calls from Indigenous activists saying that the focus on the numbers maybe isn't the point. Every single one of these numbers represents a person, a child who was taken and never returned. So we just wanted to add this really quickly before we continue on with the rest of the episode.
Well, for us, Canada Day is still approaching. For listeners, it's gonna be behind us. But it's really sort of on the forefront of the national consciousness in a way that it hasn't been before, I think. And there's been these popular movements, Cancel Canada Day, or hashtag Cancel Canada Day, or hashtag Cancel Canada. There's other popular movements as well that have been led by Indigenous peoples and allies, including campaigns to rename buildings and streets named after architects of the residential. Schools is a really bad name. Schools is a really bad term to use for these. They weren't schools, and I'm not the first one to note that. But like Egerton Ryerson. So in Toronto, after years of campaigning, people have took matters into their own hands as they toppled and beheaded prominent Egerton Ryerson statue on campus. Haudenosaunee land defenders at 1492 Landback Lane display the head on a pike.
The whole story is quite there are some twists and turns there. So it was one evening, a bunch of people gathered. This was after the news came out from Kamloops originally. A lot of people were putting the shoes of children there to symbolize all the lives lost. And then eventually they toppled it, they decapitated it, they taped the mouth closed, they beat it. And first they threw the head into Lake Ontario, where it was then recovered and then brought to 1492 Landback Lane, where, as you mentioned, it's now proudly displayed on a pike. Half of its head is caved in, splattered in red paint, mouth taped closed, and it's just a perfect act to symbolically highlight what we need to be doing in this country. Now, unfortunately, it remains a symbolic victory. Just because you toppled the statue doesn't mean that the systems put in place initially by Ryerson are done away with, but it is that first step, and it is a small victory in the meantime, and it's a galvanizing victory. Absolutely.
It seems to be marking a shift, and if I'm remembering last month, we had been hopeful that this would lead to some kind of change, and it's still in early days, but while this was all happening this month, the NDP brought forward a motion in the House of Commons to stop fighting residential school survivors in court and speed up the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. So probably a good time to remind that the calls for action include a request for 1.5 million Canadian to search the grounds of former residential schools for the burial sites of children. Right now, Harper's Conservatives denied this in 2009. Trudeau has to date not been adhering to this either, and the NDP's motion passed 271-0. However, Justin Trudeau and his Liberal cabinet members all abstained.
And that includes my own MP here in High Park, Parkdale, MP Arif Irani. I've been tweeting at him, and he's not responding. So I don't want to be a stalker, quote unquote fan here. But Arif, if you're listening to this, why didn't you vote on this?
Which he is.
Which we all know. We all know Arif is listening to this, obviously.
Huge fan of the first episode.
He thought that, again, the Red Review obviously is a liberal podcast, and now he might be having some second thoughts about that.
While the Liberals, sit in their corner and do their best to ignore this, they struggle for Indigenous self-determination and an end to Canadian genocide continues. Full implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Full implementation of the UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People. An end to boil water advisories. RCMP off Indigenous land. Land back. By the time this podcast is released, the live Anti-Canada Day Socialist Action webcast featuring author Yves Engler and Mercedes Courtourelle of Red Brand Alliance, a revolutionary working class and indigenous organization, and leading Socialist Action member Gary Porter will have passed. So you can watch that recorded webcast on our YouTube channel at any time, or if you catch it, if you manage to catch it live, congrats, you're ahead of the curve on this.
And continuing with the quest for Indigenous self-determination, that is a struggle that is really hard to separate from our ongoing environmental struggles as well, especially when you go to so-called British Columbia and the old growth logging at Fairy Creek. Now, we talked about this last month. We had Yvonne Hansen, an eco-socialist, an activist, and coming on the podcast to talk about it. And so now Yvonne Hansen is our British Columbia correspondent on the matter and has sent in the latest updates. At the request of 3 First Nations, the Pachida, the Huayat, and the DT Dot, the provincial BC NDP government agreed on June 9th to halt old growth logging in 2 areas on Vancouver Island, which includes Fairy Creek, and this is an area of almost 2,000 hectares in size. Now, it's not a permanent victory.
No.
Yeah.
Can we get a sound effect? Can we get some sound effects
Sure.
here? I think that's worthy of. I don't know what our sound effects should be. I think that's worthy of. Hey.
Small finger snaps for that.
All right. I don't know how much of that you're even going to but maybe this whole thing. I think it's worthy. We just to be clear, we have done it now. Like a half hour of things that are sad. I think this is this tiny win. Let's
celebrate it. Now, it's not a permanent moratorium on logging. It's a 2-year moratorium on logging in Fairy Creek and Walbren Valley. So it is a victory, but large-scale logging will still occur in old-growth forests directly adjacent to these areas. And there are parts of the central Walbren that are not included in this deferral order. And it does not affect logging in all critically endangered areas currently being defended. And furthermore, so we're just going to kind of erode this victory bit by bit here. Road building activities continue to divide up and parcel the forest surrounding Fairy Creek. And road building has a devastating impact on ecosystems. So even if logging is deferred, these areas will still be impacted by being separated from one another by these roads. And indeed, actually, it was the construction of new logging roads that first tipped off activists last year that old growth logging was occurring. People were looking at the satellite images and they saw new roads being built. Now, Premier Horgan in his press conference stated that all of the old growth in Fairy Creek and Central Walbren will be protected, but that is a lie. It's a bold-faced lie. And protesters from the Rainforest Flying Squad remain in place even since June 9th and that deferral order. The reason why they are remaining in place is there's still a possibility for old growth trees to be cut down. But the RCMP are becoming increasingly violent, and it's disturbing but entirely unsurprising that the police are brutalizing citizens who are trying to protect these trees while the RCMP are protecting the profits of a completely private company, Teal Jones. And as of June 29th, there have been 337 arrests and 325 days of direct action, including Extinction Rebellion holding a hunger strike. This hunger strike called for an immediate end to all old-growth logging in British Columbia, and it lasted for 7 days. The NDP government did not respond to those in this hunger strike, but the BC Green Party did, and Sonia Furstenau spent, quote, a good amount of time on the phone with the hunger strikers. Now, what you see in BC then is the Green Party is being quite opportunistic here. The NDP have alienated so many of their supporters by being so anti-environment, anti-Indigenous self-determination, that the Green Party can very easily posture here. But I'm not very convinced that either party, if in power, would do anything resembling justice.
This is just, another climate-related issue that is just really alienating so many supporters, right? I mean, I hope it's behind us by the time people are listening to this, but the heat wave that I'm experiencing here on the East Coast is nothing compared to the West Coast. For like 3 straight days as of recording this podcast, Lytton has broken the record for highest temperature ever recorded in this country. On Tuesday, the 29th, we hit...
it's almost 50 degrees.
49.5 degrees Celsius, right? This is an unprecedented heat wave. It smashed dozens of records across BC, Alberta, with authorities in Vancouver now linking to over 100 sudden deaths. And, what was John Horgan's response? I think he said fatalities are a part of life.
Yeah, that was his response.
Absolutely brutal. Like, I don't know... I am baffled. I know my reaction to most things here is just absolute befuddlement, but my God, what are you doing?
What are you doing, Horgan?
John?
It's a pretty easy stance.
I know you're listening. I know you're listening to this, and maybe we're cherry picking that quote a little bit, but also fatalities are a part of life.
It's a rough one, John, and. Connecting the heat wave to the logging. So it's not like these trees were cut down a month ago and there was a heat wave this month, but all of this is going to continue to amplify. So as Yvonne wrote us, our correspondent, roads are not really what you normally find in old growth forests. It dries out quickly. You get a bunch of small vegetation moving in there. So it really resembles what happens after a forest fire. It heats up really quickly. It absorbs heat more. And we're really setting up a situation where forest fires are more and more likely to happen. It gets hotter, we're cutting down more of the old growth, and we're just putting roads in the middle of these big forests. And as I've seen people describe it online, it's not the hottest summer of your life. You can think about it as the coldest summer of your future life as well. It's a lovely shift in perspective, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, it's I have seen this as well. Like people saying, "Oh, it's the hottest summer," and I think no.
It will get worse.
And really, maybe that should be the title of this podcast.
It will get worse.
It will get worse. That's not optimistic at all. I'm really hoping that's not a good title for this podcast, guys.
No, we'll see.
Oh, no, we are optimistic here, maybe.
With the working class, anything is possible.
Speaking of optimism, after Gaza and Israel agreed to a ceasefire in late May, the surge in Canadian media coverage waned, giving people a false sense of victory. The ousting of longtime Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the 13th of June gave this further feeling that there was some sort of fundamental change happening, right? The new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, describes himself as being to the right of Netanyahu.
In case anybody was confused.
But yeah, an unabashed ultra-nationalist. Bennett, so he advocates a Jewish nation state and champions the illegal settlements in the West Bank. Days after the new coalition government headed by Bennett was formed, Israeli far-right nationalists marched through East Jerusalem to celebrate the anniversary of the 1967 occupation of East Jerusalem. This reignited conflict between occupied Palestinians and occupier Israelis, leading to 17 Palestinians being arrested and dozens of others being assaulted. The very same night, Israel renewed air raids of Gaza after incendiary balloons were floated over the apartheid wall by Palestinian resistance.
And I think that's a great metaphor for the unevenness in this supposed conflict. One side has jet planes and an air force, and the other side is literally improvising rockets, or in this case, balloons that set light to a couple of fields. That was the Palestinian resistance. And again, that came after you had a bunch of nationalists marching through occupied Jerusalem, with their Israeli flags and basically taunting and celebrating that we are winning. And that led to the resistance again from Palestine, which then Israel used as an excuse to full on escalate to an act of war.
Indeed. On June 25th, Israel approved 31 new settlement zones in the West Bank. which led the UN to immediately, of course, condemn this expansion of illegal settlements. Palestinian protesters, most of them self-funded young men in the West Bank, now engage in daily acts of quote-unquote night confusion, right, where they burn rubber tires and blast air horns so that Israeli colonizers cannot rest on the stolen land. And as June came to a close, Israeli police escorted a bulldozer that demolished a Palestinian butcher's shop in occupied East Jerusalem, with others slated for demolition. And yet, after all this happened, Justin Trudeau spoke with Naftali Bennett on the phone on June 27th. He congratulated Bennett for his victory. He discussed ways to increase investment and trade. And from the official press release, we got this quote. Prime Minister Trudeau highlighted the close relationship between Canada and Israel, bound together by shared democratic values and vibrant people-to-people ties.
That is how our Prime Minister describes our relationship with Israel, the apartheid state of Israel. And I want to say that that's a lot of bullshit. It's
abysmal. And we need to not.
We need to not do that. We need to keep up the pressure on all political parties. But in addition, we need to attack at the source all the different institutions in our lives that are profiting from Israeli apartheid and that are complicit in this. So for me, that means campaigning against the University of Toronto that is super, super culpable and complicit in what Israel is doing overseas and provides a lot of cover for them as well. So while the conflict in Palestine continues to rage, and it is something that we're going to continue covering here, even while our mainstream media moves on to other stories that are hot that month, literally or figuratively, we can at least revel in the turmoil that's been happening in the Green Party, because it might not seem like Palestine and the Green Party have anything to do to each other, but it does. It does. And the Palestine conflict and the genocide of the Palestinian people has led to the Green Party, at least for me, symbolizing the front-loading washer that you chuck a brick into, because this thing is spinning out of control and there's a lot of destruction. So let's back up a bit. Prior to this month, the Green Caucus, the sitting MPs belonging to the Green Party of Canada, there were only 3 of them. You have Elizabeth May, you have Paul Manley, and then you had Jenica Atwin, a Fredericton MP in the Green Party. And while it was in the news for, weeks and weeks, what was happening in Palestine, she tweeted out in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and she condemned Israeli apartheid. She used the word apartheid. Now, at the same time, the newly elected leader of the party, Annamie Paul, who is a Zionist, put forth an official statement that called for both sides to put down their weapons. And so, like we already mentioned, the weapons on one side are, fighter jets, and on the other side we have these improvised balloons and whatnot. And really, Annamie Paul's perspective or opinion is like that of Justin Trudeau. Now, Atwin must have felt pretty safe in doing this. It didn't end up working that way, but she actually subtweeted Annamie Paul saying that the official Green Party statement was totally inadequate. That was the first act of this. And then it just got escalated a lot, because then we have this other character being introduced to the story, Noah Zatzman. Noah Zatzman is a senior advisor for Paul and is a self-described Zionist. And as a lot of different leaders in Canada, not all of them, obviously, most leaders in Canada still suck a lot when it comes to Palestine, but you had some people like Jagmeet Singh and Dimitri Lascaris, who is also a leading member of the Green Party. They were tweeting these things about Israel and about Palestine. This really irked the Zionist Noah Zatzman, who took to Facebook, took a stand against what he thought were all these hateful politicians who were opposing Israel. In a Facebook post, Zatzman named figures such as Jagmeet Singh, Dimitri Lascaris, as well as Green Party MPs who were critical of Israel as well, and he called them anti-Semitic. We talked about this last month as well, that that way of trying to stifle any sort of legitimate criticism of Israel by weaponizing anti-Semitism as a term. So Zatzman in this post also, vowed to defeat the Green Party MPs who are against Israel, and was saying that the new MPs that would replace those old, anti-Semitic ones are going to be, quote, progressive. They're going to be Antifa. They're going to be pro-LGBT. They're going to be pro-indigenous sovereignty. And of course, they're going to be Zionists. He included that as his ideal description of a new Green Party MP. I don't know how to make sense of a Zionist who is also pro-indigenous sovereignty, or a Zionist who is also anti-fascist. But Zatzman has this in his head. That's what he is going to find for the party. Now, that immediately escalated all the drama in the Green Party, because even though Zatzman did not have his contract renewed because of these statements, Annemie Paul did not contest the statements, and to this point in time has not contested or denounced the statements of Zatzman. And she has also refused to apologize or support Atwin. So, after being shunned by the party and being attacked by the leader's advisor, Atwin actually changed parties. So Green Party at one point had 3 MPs. Now they're down to 2 because Jenica Atwin left. Which party did she join, Dan?
I actually don't know. And at this point, the Bloc Québécois? I don't know. What does she do? What does she do? Tell me. I want to say it's NDP.
No, it's not the NDP. Of course not.
Guess...
Also, the Bloc Québécois would be kind of funny because now the Quebec branch of the Green Party is also officially called for the resignation of Annemie Paul. No, but Atwin left to the Liberals of all parties, but which seems funny because Atwin, what precipitated all of this was Atwin calling Israel an apartheid state and supporting Palestinians. But Justin Trudeau and the Liberal stance on this is the exact same. Now, I assume what motivated Atwin here was some sort of self-preservation. She was the first person to win that seat as a Green Party person. That was a historic victory for the Green Party. And if she was going to leave, she was going to leave to a party that would be able to win. And that's the Liberals, because they've held that seat in the past. And since joining the Liberals, she has toned down everything and has taken back the word apartheid. She now says that that was an inappropriate word to use. And she just wants peace for both sides again. So at one point, she had a fairly principled stance, fled to the Liberals, immediately retracted that, yet the story with the Green Party is not over, not one bit. So there was an emergency meeting called to discuss Annemie Paul's role in the party. Previously, former party leader Elizabeth May was also the first ever Green Party MP. She met with Paul before this meeting, one-on-one, to discuss what was going to happen. And May and Paul Manley have been trying to convince Paul to apologize to Atwin so she can return to the Green Party. Paul is not apologizing, Atwin is not returning, and instead Paul threatened Elizabeth May, saying that she needs to fall in line behind Annemie Paul or else she will face the consequences. All of this then brings back my thoughts to the Green Party leadership race. I'm not sure if you followed that leadership race very closely, Dan. It ended up being very close.
It was too much.
It was too much.
It was too much.
You had a very crowded field, including 2 eco-socialists, Miriam Haddad and Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri Lascaris finished in second place, a very close second place. If I recall correctly, Annemie Paul got 13,000 votes. Dimitri Lascaris got 10,000 votes. And despite the fact that they were so close, they were polar opposites when it came to their political stances. Annemie Paul is a Zionist. Dimitri Lascaris is well known for his work in Palestinian solidarity. Annemie Paul is pretty much free market solutions to climate change, whereas Lascaris was very much for, nationalizing the fossil fuel and other energy sectors so that could be put to human needs. So there's now a really big turmoil brewing. You have a very divided party, and what is happening, you had senior members of the Green Party drafting a letter that was being circulated, but this is senior members of the Green Party Federal Council. And they accused Annemie Paul of violating party policy and of being autocratic. And at that meeting I alluded to earlier, they discussed the option of holding a no confidence vote to remove Paul as the party leader, but they decided not to do this just yet. Instead, they decided that Paul can remain in her position as party leader on the condition that she publicly denounce Zatzman's comments and fall back in line with party policy. And she has been given a deadline until July 20th. And if she does not denounce Zatzman's statements by July 20th, that will trigger a no confidence vote. And to this point in time, she has not yet done so. So maybe on the next episode of the podcast, we're going to have some more updates to discuss here. Now, Dan, I'm just looking at your face right now. Obviously, the listeners can't see your face because this is a podcast and it's notable for being an audio format. And your face is very much a visual thing. I know you haven't been following the story very much. I'm the one that helped script this along with one of our members, Patrick. What is your immediate reaction then? You're hearing this. This is a soap opera, basically. What is your response? I think that is the sound that best describes this. Yes.
I think I am
more stunned silence.
I think there is a reason why I quickly became disillusioned with like student politics that is just a property of politics. And wow.
Yep. So this is all happening.
Wow.
And for anyone who's interested in learning more about this from the inside, Socialist Action will be hosting another live webcast. We do these every Thursday. And people can listen in live and ask their questions. But we have a live webcast entitled Turmoil in the Green Party. It's going to be hosted by Socialist Action on Thursday, July 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can find it on YouTube. And it will be featuring Dimitri Lascaris, who is that very same eco-socialist in the Green Party who almost won the leadership bid. And we're going to get to hear the inside scoop on the future of the Green Party, the viability of the Green Party, and we'll also hear from some other socialists who are instead fighting to create a new revolutionary eco-socialist party in Canada as a alternative to the Green Party. So tune into that. So here at the Red Review, we're very excited to be joined by author and anti-capitalist activist Gary Kinsman. Gary has been a longtime queer rights activist, is the author of The Regulation of Desire, Homo and Heterosexualities in Canada, and is a co-author of The Canadian War on Queers, National Security as Sexual Regulation. He is joining us today from Sudbury. Gary, welcome very much to the podcast.
Yeah, I should actually say I'm on the territories of the Tikamishiga Anishinaabe and other Anishinaabe people. Sudbury is the settler name for where I am right now. So I'm really happy to be here.
And in addition to all the things I introduced you as, you are also a spokesperson for the No Pride in Policing Coalition, which operates mostly in Toronto, from what I understand. So for all of our listeners coast to coast to coast, do you want to just describe its recent history and its connections with Pride Toronto and Black Lives Matter?
For sure. So the No Pride in Policing Coalition actually emerges in 2018, but to actually fully understand where it comes from, you really need to go back to 2016 when Black Lives Matter Toronto stopped the Pride Toronto parade at College and Yonge, had to sit down and had a series of demands, a whole series of community demands pushing forward what various different people of color and Indigenous groups were pushing for, but also calling, in the context of police killings of Andrew Loku and other people in the city of Toronto, for there to be no institutional police presence within Pride. So that is 2016. That's quite a turn in the history of Pride Toronto, which had become quite corporate dominated, government funding, defining its politics. We just had moved through what I describe as the Quia Wars. Queers Against Israeli Apartheid was a Palestine solidarity group that the executive and many funders of Pride Toronto actually tried to kick out. We resisted that and were successful. And in response to Pride Toronto trying to back out of the demands that it had actually agreed to on Pride Day, when Black Lives Matter Toronto, which was a major, Black liberation group that emerged especially against police violence and called for defunding and eventually abolishing the police. We were able, in alliance with Black Lives Matter Toronto and other groups, to ensure that all of their demands were actually passed in January 2017. So all of the demands were passed by about 80% of the membership of Pride Toronto, which was quite incredible, including the demand around the police, which was the one that sort of white racists, both among gay men, but also in the mainstream media, sort of mobilized against us. So that went on for a number of years that we had that position in Pride Toronto. But in the fall of 2018, for some reason, we didn't fully understand it at the beginning, the executive director and the board of Pride Toronto invited the police back in without any consultation with the membership. We now know that's because of funding that was offered to Pride Toronto through Federal Cabinet Minister Bill Morneau, who's no longer in the cabinet. They were offered significant amounts of funding if they would get the police back in, both from Public Safety Canada and from Canadian Heritage. So we formed, actually specifically, No Pride in Policing Coalition formed at that point as an alliance of different groups, including Black Lives Matter Toronto, Queer Ontario, whole series of groups, lots of people not connected with any groups, to maintain the position that the police should not have any sort of institutional presence within our festivals or within our parades. Now, since then, obviously, there's been another, and we've been able to maintain that, right? Even though the executive director and lots of funders and the government tried to resist that, we've been able to maintain that position within Pride Toronto. But then you have the global uprising against police brutality after the murders, both in the United States and Canada. In the spring of 2020, you have massive mobilizations. No Pride in Policing Coalition is a group that takes direction from Black racialized people and also from Indigenous people. And we had a consultation with a number of Black and racialized activists who basically said, well, you actually need to move beyond just calling for the police to be out of Pride. You actually need, in response to this global uprising against anti-Black racism and against anti-Indigenous racism and against police brutality and murder, you need to actually move towards defunding the police and abolishing the police. So that's what we did last year. And we organized a rally, more like a teach-in at Nathan Phillips Square on Pride Day, and attracted thousands of people, both through live stream and who were physically there. And this year we did another event, although we extended our theme. So the theme was, we must change everything, creating livable, queer, trans, and two-spirit lives without police and prison. So we extended to also talk about other aspects of the carceral state in terms of the prison system. I can talk to you about that event, but that sort of gives you a bit of a history of who we are. So we're a queer and trans anti-racist group taking direction from Black people and other racialized people and Indigenous people. And we're obviously now organizing for defunding and abolishing the police. And we think that's central to what Pride Day needs to be.
Yeah, so it's fair to say then that you're trying to bring Pride back to its radical roots, its radical history.
For sure. I mean, that's definitely part of what we're doing. And this is the second year we've actually organized events separate from the virtual events that Pride Toronto has. So we're now much more distinct from Pride Toronto, not just sort of an opposition force or a caucus within it. We're actually organizing a lot outside Pride Toronto, which in some ways is still a corporate entity. And the current executive director of Pride Toronto has actually said at some point the police will be let back in, and we're going to continue to organize around that. So yes, we're trying to return Pride to its radical roots, perhaps in two different ways. I mean, Pride is actually a commemoration of the Stonewall Rebellions in 1969 in New York City, when Black and brown, queer and trans people, and trans women in particular, fought back against the police, leading to 3 days of rioting in Greenwich Village that actually sort of sent shockwaves around the world and sort of established the gay and lesbian liberation movements as a global movement. So Pride Day is actually to commemorate that rebellion against the police, that resistance to the police, which was led by Black and racialized people. That's been forgotten in sort of the mainstreaming corporatization of Pride. We're also remembering and trying to bring Pride back to the radical roots of 1981, when the first Pride March and festival that was timed to celebrate the Stonewall Rebellion at the end of June was organized. There were other Pride events earlier in the Toronto and Canadian context. So that was an event that was organized in the context of the massive bath raids, the massive police repression of men who had sex with men that year, and the massive demonstrations that took place. And some of those demonstrations involved significant numbers of people of color. Lamona Johnson, the widow of Albert Johnson, who'd been killed by the Toronto police, spoke at the February 20th, 1981 rally. The week before the Pride March and Festival on June 28th, 1981, there was actually a major demonstration against another bath raid that two bath raids actually that the police had organized that became quite rebellious. It was attacked by queer bashers, and the police actually attacked the crowd. So it's in the context of mass resistance to the police that Pride sort of reemerges at the end of June to commemorate the Stonewall Rebellions. And I was one of the organizers of Pride in 1981, and I was also the person who was the chief sort of marshal coordinating things that day. I know that we got, and I'm not sure about the language I can use here, you can edit it out if you want. I got into real trouble for both us going on Yonge Street, which was sort of against their policies at that point in time, the police policies, but also that we stopped outside 52 Division, which was the coordinating division for the bath raids, and people chanted what was a very popular chant that year, "Fuck you 52," like over
Fuck
and
you,
over
52.
again. Yeah. And that's sort of part of the history that we want to come back to. And instead, what's happened with Pride as it's become more institutionalized, more state-funded, and more corporate-funded in particular, is that it's lost that type of grassroots politics and perspective. And really, in some ways, it's like TD Bank Day, Bank Pride Day, right? It really is Pride for, like, all of these institutions that have contingents, is obviously before the pandemic, would actually build pride in their business, in their bank, in the context of Pride Day, rather than it actually being about the liberation movement of queer and trans and two-spirit people. So we're trying to bring Pride back to that, and we think it's really important that every year there be public Pride events like there was this year that actually, took over Yonge Street, that, protested outside X University against the racism of its history, that reproduced the Black Lives Matter sit-down protest at College and Yonge, and also went to police headquarters. So it was actually quite a marvelous and empowering march that we were able to organize this year. And we want to keep doing that. We want to establish a tradition of that sort of radical, anti-police, abolitionist type of approach. And I think it's also maybe important to just mention that abolitionist politics are quite central to No Pride in Policing Coalition. And by that, we don't simply just mean, abolishing the police and prisons and getting rid of the carceral state. Certainly that's a central part of what we're talking about, but we're also talking about creating a different type of society, a different type of world, where the funds that now go under neoliberal capitalism to this massive expansion of policing and prisons. I mean, those people on the left who've always talked about neoliberalism as being cutting back funding for state agencies are actually just wrong, because neoliberalism's always been invested in a massive expansion of the police and the prison system and law and order and racism in many different ways. So we think it's really important for those funds to actually be transferred to community-based agencies that will actually look after people in terms of social caring and their social needs. So it's really about a different type of society that, rather than focusing on punishing people and putting people away in cages and prisons, actually focuses on meeting people's needs and caring for people. So it's a social transformation project, right? It really strikes at the heart of patriarchal racist capitalism, and really is talking about building a different type of society based on meeting people's human needs and people's caring for people.
No, that is remarkable. And I was there on Sunday at that rally, and Desmond Cole made that same argument very eloquently, that it's not just about destroying eventually the institution of policing, but it's to take those materials symbolized in that building and returning them to the commons. And there was actually a great line I found that you had said in an interview before, where you wanted to make Pride back in the day not so much about a slogan like gay is just as good as straight, but rather smash heterosexual imperialism. And that for me summarizes that push to fight against the corporation or the corporatization of Pride. And what are the other strategies then you have at this point then to try and mobilize the forces of queer people, of trans people, of anti-racist and anti-capitalist aside from this? Do you one day envision an entire Pride movement, more than just the one march, more than the one rally, that's completely separate from the corporate overlords?
Certainly I do. I just wanted to come back to the slogan, smash heterosexual imperialism. That was actually used in the We Demand demonstration, which we're on the 50th anniversary of at the end of August in 1971. Where people actually were holding signs saying smash heterosexual imperialism, which gives you a sense of sort of the changes from a sort of gay liberation type politics that saw itself as part of a much broader composition of struggle of left-wing forces. Not that there weren't problems in the left in terms of homophobia and heterosexism and transphobia, there certainly were, but that, you know, the gay movement actually emerged out of this broader rebellion against, you know, racist patriarchal capitalism, and was part of that. And now, of course, it's been entirely separated. So we do want to resist those corporate overlords, as you describe them. We want to resist that type of government funding and restriction. We don't want Pride to simply be a sort of homo nationalist event where Canada gets celebrated. You know, on Sunday, we actually talked about the need to cancel Canada Day. We talked about the need to oppose genocide. We talked about the need for queer and trans and two-spirit people to support the Palestinian struggle. So it's a much broader politics that we want to put in place. And I think that part of what this is about is to recognize that within queer and trans communities, there are class and race struggles, racialized class struggles that are going on right now. And what we're saying is that we're on one side of that struggle, right? And that struggle has usually been ignored under cover of there's supposedly some unitary common gay community or queer community, which has allowed those people who are like middle class and white and privileged to actually push their own interests as supposedly the interests of the community. And we're here to say that's not going to fly anymore, that the most oppressed and marginalized queer, trans, and two-spirit people, their needs and concerns need to be at the center of our movement and organizing. And that necessarily means we have to deal with the problems of the police and the prison system and getting rid of them and creating a different type of social world. We must, you know, change everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's incredible. You mentioned that there are, in addition to Toronto Pride, different events that you're planning for this year. Can I ask what those are going to look like? Is there anything you can tell us? Like what strategies are you using practically?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been using the strategy of having public protests, obviously with physical distancing and masking during the context of the pandemic. We also, in the lead up to our Pride activities this year, organized 2 online webinars, one basically about the theme, where we brought together 2 Indigenous and 2 Black activists to actually sort of work through some of the questions and concerns that they have. And we also brought together sex workers and queers in another panel. So, I mean, we're trying to build connections between other groups of people. In the future, I can't really entirely predict what we're going to do. I would think that one of the things we're going to try and do is to both do more popular education and more reaching out, and also to try to consolidate the ways in which a whole layer of queer and trans activists have been attracted to the No Pride in Policing Coalition group. So to try and get them more involved, to get them more involved in defining what the group is, and to sort of where we're going to go. Obviously, we're committed to radical social transformation. and an abolitionist politics. And we're going to have to see how that develops. So I'm sure that we will be organizing events in the fall, but I can't tell you exactly when and where and on what topics. But we're not going away. And we feel really inspired by what we've been able to do so far as the No Pride in Policing Coalition.
No, absolutely. And before we wrap this up, I have one last thought. Obviously, it was such a big demand to organize, cops out of pride. There's no pride in policing. It's the namesake. But it also reminds me that Justin Trudeau also loves to make appearances at Pride. And in the ideal Pride, put on by the radicals, the grassroots of all of this, as you put, the most oppressed amongst us, would Justin Trudeau be allowed to be there?
No. I mean, that's a very simple answer, but I mean, he tries to use he uses Black Lives Matter protests, he uses anything to actually try to, in a certain very superficial way, act like he's supporting, Black people or queer people. I mean, it's actually quite ridiculous. I mean, this is a whole other area that we could go into and I'll just mention one example. So in 2017, Justin Trudeau read the apology statement for the massive purge campaigns against lesbians and gay men and gender diverse people. But central to that was actually the expungement of historically unjust criminal code convictions. We just found out that there's been a total of, count them, 9 expungements since that time, right? Because of the ridiculously limited criteria, which doesn't include body house laws, even though we were successful in getting rid of them, right? Doesn't include vagrancy laws, doesn't include body house laws, which of course are some of the laws that more people have been arrested under. So that only 9 people have had their criminal code convictions expunged is just ridiculous. And it shows the superficial character of a lot of what the federal government is doing. For instance, there's still a blood ban, right? Against queer and trans people, right? They promised over and over again, this is going to disappear. And now, of course, they're having problems even getting the ban of conversion therapy, which is not a form of therapy, it's a form of terrorism, adopted, right? So, we spend years waiting for the Liberal government to do things when it actually, it tries to use our communities, as Bill Morneau did, in terms of trying to get the police back into Pride Toronto, and they're supporting and constructing a particular layer of people within our communities who are predisposed to support the military and the police, right? They actually are building up an infrastructure for those people through various funding processes, which of course is going to exacerbate the racialized class divisions within our community. But we're saying that racialized class struggle is now ongoing, and we're going to be naming it and organizing in relationship to it in ways that people weren't in the past, right?
Yeah, it's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure to speak with you. I'm just wondering if you have any upcoming projects or groups that you'd like to highlight before we say goodbye.
Well, certainly there is the No Pride in Policing Coalition and all of the actions that we organize. Maybe I should also mention that it is the 50th anniversary of the We Demand demonstration, and we're hoping that we can actually organize, whether they're probably going to be online events at the end of August, that will actually both commemorate that demonstration, which was against the limitations of the 1969 criminal code reform, which a lot of people try to forget, but also talk about its limitations, like to actually talk about how it didn't go far enough. In fact, it didn't really even start to develop an anti-racist critique or an Indigenous critique, and had lots of flaws to it. So we both want to point to its significance and importance, but also the major limitations that it had. And in terms of projects I have, if I can mention one just individually, I'm working on the 3rd edition of the Regulation of Desire. It was last published in 1996. So the update chapter from 1996 to now is quite gigantic. It's been a lot of work. I'm hoping that it will be out next spring, maybe early next spring, published by Concordia University Press. So those are various things that are coming up, and there's always, other activities that are taking place.
Well, thank you so much, Gary. And when that book hopefully gets published on time, maybe we get you back on and we'll all read it, and then we'll have another conversation about the third year that No Pride in Policing Coalition is going to be having its own Pride activities and rallies and actions. And hopefully it's bigger and better than ever. So thanks again so much for coming on.
Thank you.
I think that'll about do it for the June review. A huge thanks goes out to all of our guests, to everybody who contributed to this episode, through writing, through research, through editing, and also to just you listeners who have provided some fantastic feedback after the last episode. We would again really appreciate more feedback, whatever thoughts you have. Definitely let us know about that, especially if you think Red Maple is a better name.
If you like what you heard today in terms of the politics being espoused and our stance and position on what to us seems like a pretty straightforward issue, you can find out more at socialistaction.ca. You can follow Socialist Action on YouTube at Socialist Action Canada, where we post weekly live webcasts. And for all of the groups that are on the ground fighting for a more just world that we mentioned in this podcast, you can find their information in the description of this podcast. You'll find links to their websites or to their social media or to fundraisers. So support them as well. It's going to take a very multifaceted approach to overthrow this really inhumane capitalist system. And in the meantime, we're going to keep coming back every month and try and highlight the voices of people on the ground fighting, and to try and keep you up to date about what Canada as a state is doing to its own people and abroad. So until next month, take care and solidarity.